Good evening.
Hello, good night to everybody. Can everybody hear me?
Now I hear you. You hear me?
Okay. Yes, I
This
can
is the
actually
Cuban
hear you.
ambassador.
Thank you. Good
Okay.
evening. I'm Dr. Joyanne Chico. Um, and welcome to all our friendship members right now in all over the Caribbean, the world. Um, it is great that we're meeting right now as this coincides with um, the global campaign. And I want to thank everybody for showing up and being part of this campaign as we continue to strive for equality in Cuba and for the Cuban people. I just want to say thank you. Good evening, and as I we go through the entire time that we're together, that we come up with um, a few more ideas and a few more things that we can actually work on to make this fight and this how you call it, this friendship stronger, and we can face whatever is happening in Cuba. Um, you know, so to start off, um, I am Dr. Joanne Chico. I studied in Cuba. I studied in Cuba from 2011 to 2018. I'm a medical doctor, and hopefully soon enough I'll be able to return there to specialize um, in neurology. So I'm looking forward to that. And welcome again to everybody. Tonight, what we'll be focusing on is the Caribbean Network for Solidarity with Cuba presents a global campaign to coincide with the annual UN General Assembly to vote against the US blockade of Cuba, thereby to end the US blockade of Cuba as part of its campaign, right? So I want to say a special good evening to His Excellency Ambassador um, Sergio Pastrana. Gracias por venir. Cuban Ambassador to Barbados. Um, Isaac Sani, who is the Canadian network, who's part of the Canadian network in solidarity with Cuba. And we have one of our other speakers, well, cultural performance. We have Obi Egbuya. I'm not sure if I got the name correct. A member of the Zimbabwe Cuba Friendship Association, and all our special invited guests to this very warm and amazing meeting. So first off, we have His Excellency Sergio Pastrana, who will speak to us on the legal and other regulatory steps the US has taken over the years to construct the blockade. And just a little bio on Ambassador. Sergio Pastrana is a Cuban ambassador to Barbados, hails from the city of Havana. He graduated from the School of Letters and Arts of the University of Havana in History of English Literature and Culture in 1975. He accomplished his postgrad at the Institute of International Relations of the Ministry of Foreign Relations in Cuba. His interest in international cooperation related to the history of early international contacts of the Cuban scientific community and its influence on the building of the national scientific capacity in Cuba. So, His Excellency will now speak to us on his topic. Thank you again.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for this opportunity to share with the Caribbean Network for solidarity with Cuba on these issues that take so much precedence these days with the 30th occasion in which the vote against the embargo will take place at the UN. You know, the blockade was originated out of the early days of the revolution, and though it can be officially, you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yeah, while you can try and state that it was started officially by the signing of President John F. Kennedy of the first law for the embargo, the first direct measure taken by him. It has started way back on at the very beginning of the revolution. There were a series of moves that were provoking this situation of isolation and the menace to the early revolution. For a number of years, this embargo was meant to try to create instability, and it comes out of a memorandum that was emitted by one of the members of the Department of State of the 60s, in which he started that the aim of the embargo was to create insatisfaction, loss of access to resources, and the to try to alienate the support that the revolution had at the moment, which was overwhelming, and um, and to try to make that an effect that would eventually try to provoke a regime change in Cuba, in the same way in which in 1954 it had been applied to Guatemala and other countries, and Iran, etc. Uh, the fact that it started so early was all the time by the US government enforced very strongly under the Trade with the Enemy Act, which is something like sounds out of this world, a trade with an enemy, because Cuba has never been an enemy of the United States. In fact, Cuba has done nothing to the United States directly. Cuba only fought for its independence, its self determination, and achieved the triumph of the revolution against a very backward regime that was supported by the United States at the time. But we did nothing to them. And it's part of a longer differendum that existed with a number of persons within the policy or determination in the US of the extreme right that always tried to view Cuba as a protectorate and had implemented everything to turn it into a protectorate for the first 60 years of the 20th century, since the occupation in 1898 by US troops, after the 30 years of fights of the Cubans for independence. But then, after these first measures were implemented, at the time of the 80s, there was a move by the government of the US to make this a standard figure and try to put this into law. And a number of laws were enacted that turned the definite solution of the blockade into the hands of the Congress. Up to that time, it has always been executive actions. But what is less known is that most of the embargo blockade resides on executive actions all the time. And what is less known is that most of those activities that have turned this into an extreme and constantly increasing news against the neck of the Cuban people resides in a number of measures that have been taken by different administrations and which took in an extraordinary, higher, even worse manner when the Trump administration imposed 243 more measures against the liberation of the laws of the embargo or the different steps taken to ease the embargo as a reaction against what had happened under the administration of President Barack Obama, who, not changing basically the interests of the US government, had, however, for the first time, allowed the establishment of diplomatic relations between both countries, which are still standing, and opened a number of areas in which there was the possibility for positive relations of normal cooperation between institutions and bodies in the US government and in the Cuban government, and also civil society, etc. Personally, I'm very well aware of that because I was part of negotiations regarding the scientific environment, which, by the way, had existed throughout between scientists in Cuba and in the United States. And it's well known, for instance, that in the case of hurricanes, there's been a constant cooperation with the U.S. institutions that deal with advisory on hurricanes, etc., and through the World Meteorological Organization's institutions, both in Cuba and the U.S., that the relationships have existed throughout, all the time. But not only that, scientists devoted to medicine or to biology or to oceanography have had cooperation throughout, and they provided very good results that are a benefit for both countries. All of that was completely curtailed by the measures imposed by um, President Donald Trump, the former administration. When the new administration came and Joseph Biden was elected as president, um, right before that, right before the change of government, in the last week practically of the government of Donald Trump, the Department of State listed Cuba again in the list that is developed by the Department of State, which is a totally illegal list in terms that it has no value internationally. It's only a mechanism of the proper government of the United States, which is, by the way, dominated by the Department of State. And they listed Cuba again in this list that had been, of course, taken out of it in 2015 after the relationships between the both governments started to be renovated. And this has mm, taken an extraordinary toll on the ability of Cuba to have normal trade and normal relations in terms of commerce internationally, because this has a frightening effect on any partner, because any person, any partner, any institution, any organization that will deal in cooperation with Cuba at any for any cost, even for normal contracts of insurance of some shipment or the hiring of some ship to transport any staples like food or medicine or you name it, will be worried that this can provoke extraordinary fines that are enacted by US courts on persons that deal with states sponsors of terrorism. So this has a chilling effect that increases the price of everything Cuba has to acquire internationally by normal trade. And in fact, is an act, practically is an act of war, is an undeclared act of war. The fact that is under the trade with an enemy is proves it's a war, an active, aggressive measure that has no basis in international um, any international laws and any laws that regulate trade and relations between countries in the world. Anyway, in this environment, what came to be these new activities of the after the Trump administration has has had no dramatic change after the new administration was established and Biden entered the picture, the government of the present administration of the United States. And you must take into account that all of this happens in a moment in which the whole world had been, I mean, under the effect of cascading crisis, first of the pandemic that for 2 years affected most of almost all the world. And Cuba was fortunate to have the enough forces in terms of medical uh, personnel and the ability of the Cuban scientists to develop not only vaccines but even respirators. When the company that used to sell respirators to Cuba was bought by an American holding company and suddenly denied the possibility of even providing spare parts for the ones we had. So, enabled to have the possibility of treating our own uh, victims of COVID 19 who went under respiratory stress, Cuban scientists had to develop and produce 300 respirators locally made in Cuba, enabled to supply them to every ward that had extreme cases of COVID 19. All of that happened under this stress of extraordinary measures against trade, against the possibility of providing a regular flow of fuel, of energy, of food, medicines, etc. Fortunately, Cuban ability for vaccinating the whole population provided that Cuba was one of the countries with less deaths, according to statistics compiled by international organizations due to COVID 19. And but after that, we had the rest of the different crises that have, I mean, affected the whole world, the supply chains, the ability to buy food and medicines and energy, the increased cost of energy in the world. And after that, with the war at this time in Europe, every one of these situations have turned even more difficult. In the middle of all that, the embargo, the blockade against Cuba, is the worst aggression because it has no reason, and there was no reason at all to put again Cuba in the states as sponsors of terrorism. A number of excuses were found, some of them supported by some governments, like the one in Colombia, who said that Cuba was a sponsor of terrorism for some reasons, while Cuba had been all the time working towards the peace in Colombia, supporting that activity with a number of other countries in the world. And at the asking of the Colombian government had been the venue for these conversations. But the government changed, and the new government took the opportunity to provoke this. Now, the new government in Colombia is saying Cuba has been one of the big supporters of peace in Colombia for a very long time, which is it's already well known everywhere in the world. But that was the excuse, and now Cuba sits in that list that complicates enormously the possibilities to have a normal relation with international trade, commerce, etc. This vote at the United Nations the next couple of days, on the second and the third, has been taken up by the U.S. Cuba Normalization Committee to run a 24 protest against these laws of the United States and this aggression towards Cuba. And it is very important that the networks of solidarity with Cuba, both the Caribbean Network, the Latin American and Caribbean Network of Solidarity with Cuba, engage with these partners in this marathon that will take place after the 2nd of October, the October 2nd and during October 3rd, during the time in which the, the General Assembly of the United Nations is going to hold this vote of this resolution claiming for the end of this illegal embargo of the United States against Cuba. This type of unilateral coercive measures taken by powerful states against other small developing states, is a measure of extreme violence that, in the end, is uh, is a genocide against a whole population, because the excuse is that this is for some reason displayed against the government of Cuba, but the fact is that every Cuban, every mother and child, every elderly, every person that lives in Cuba suffers these extraordinary measures that must be denied by the whole world community and proved to be a, a, an act of violence, of war against a small country whose only uh, guilt is to defend its own sovereignty and its own um, motherland against this constant aggression of over 60 years. I all the time say that is famous, the siege of Troy. The siege of Troy lasted 10 years, and that whole war lasted 30. This embargo, this vendetta against Cuba, against this small island nation of the Caribbean, has lasted more than 60 years, double the years of the War of Troy. So, friends, thanks for your constant solidarity. And remember that we have to engage strongly with our partners in the US and in other areas of the world in order to demonstrate our commitment and our defense of the rights of small island developing states to have their sovereignty respected. Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for letting me share these ideas with all of you.
Yes, Ambassador. I really loved how you broke down everything, and I mean it's not every time that you actually you get the breakdown of the of what has transpired throughout the past few years in terms of the relations with Cuba and the US. I really, really love the fact that you spoke about in one of your last pointers when you spoke about it is the people who suffer. It is the people who suffer at the end. At the end of the day, it's the Cuban population suffering, and it's a vicious cycle because at the end of the day, we're all interconnected. And when one person suffers, you have the rest of the people suffering. We may not see it in a huge impact, but we may feel the little ripples, whether it's in the Caribbean, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in the other side of the world, wherever it is, we may feel the ripples because as people suffer, everybody around the world feels it. And I really
Yeah,
do believe that it is against human rights. It is a breach of human rights that this is happening with Cuba right now.
as it is. No
Yes.
man is an island, entire of itself.
Exactly. No man is an island, and every island has his contribution to the plate.
Yeah,
As I usually say, we can all share something in this world. There's space for all of us, and we all have a unique contribution to this world. And Cuba definitely has made quite a few contributions. I mean, right here in my homeland in St. Lucia, I can tell you the Cubans have gone above and beyond for our population. And I can only imagine elsewhere in the world, you know, people going out to actually be part of this and be part of the fight. So when we look at, illnesses like COVID, which was ready to destroy our populations, we actually had that human resource come in and actually lend a hand. And I mean, this is something that, it's not, you cannot be blind to it. If you're blind to it, you're forcing yourself to be blind to it.
yeah.
And I really appreciate it. Thank you, Ambassador, for being here and gracing us with everything you said so far.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Okay, so um tonight, unfortunately, Mr. Isaac Sani cannot join us. He was a foreign speaker. He cannot join us due to a family emergency.
Oh,
And yes, unfortunately, hopefully everything is fine with him and his family. So we will invite Mr. T White on to have a conversation with us. Hi, Mr. T. Welcome.
Hi, hi, Joanne. Hi, Ambassador, Your Excellency. Um,
yeah.
I think, as I said, Mr. Isaac has had a family emergency, so he's not going to be able to come along tonight and present his topic, which was to look at the actual effect of the blockade on ordinary Cubans, and I think that's one of the points the ambassador touched on. And then also to speak a bit about the importance of solidarity with Cuba, particularly in our region of the Caribbean, because Cuba has always been there for the Caribbean. And it's very much part
Certainly.
of the big Caribbean family. So you could say one of the heaviest responsibilities of people in the Caribbean is to raise our voice against what the ambassador described as this cruel and illegal policy of the United States government to basically impose suffering on the people of Cuba. So,
Right.
in terms of adjusting the program in light of Isaac's family emergency, we asked Dr. Joyanne if she would be in a position to say something about her experience of studying in Cuba and what she made of that experience working there, and then we'll go on to the cultural contributions from Brother Obi Egbuna.
Right. So, T, when I went to Cuba, um, and it's so amazing because I left A level in 2011, and I went to Cuba. that same year, and I wanted to be surprised. I wanted to experience it for myself, not based on the experience of others, but for myself. I wanted to get an idea as to what Cuba was really like. Um, it was different. The culture was different. Um, I was always somebody who was reserved, and going to Cuba, I actually opened up to the culture. I experienced something that I don't know if I can ever find the right words to actually tell you. Um, One thing I can definitely say I am, and I was, and I'm still very grateful for my opportunity to have studied in Cuba. I was one of the scholarship awardees from the HSA during that time, and I promised myself that no matter what, um, when I enter Cuba, I will leave with honors. I will graduate with honors, and that's exactly what I did. That was my first goal. My second goal was to experience the culture, see the beauty of Cuba, and I will tell you that I experienced the transition from 2011 to 2018. The transition that the structural transition, the cultural transition, um, the opening up of Cuba's wings, showing to the world that there's more than what somebody might just see. There's more to experience. Cuba has a beauty that I will always say it's comparable to St. Lucia probably even more, because I mean just the beaches alone, they're very, very beautiful. And I mean, it's an experience that I don't know if I will ever be able to write and give the exact feeling of what it was like to actually study in Cuba. And I mean, if there's one thing that you identify among all the Cubans, it's this selfless way of giving, this generosity that it's very limited in this world, and you get that from the Cuban people. If there's 2 pounds of sugar, you must know that you will get at least 1 pound of sugar from that 2 pounds. You will not leave without the 2 pounds of sugar. And I experience it right here in St. Lucia, still at work, where I work with the Cuban nurses and the doctors. And it's the same. There's this generosity, this solidarity with everybody, and it's a pity. It's a pity that this is happening, and this has been going on for so long in Cuba.
Can I mean, thank you very much for that contribution. I wanted to ask you a quick question. You
Sure.
you've spoken about the generosity of the Cuban people now, and the ambassador said that the aim of the U.S. policy is to increase the suffering of ordinary Cubans so much that they want to carry out regime change. What's your
Right.
experience in terms of how the Cuban people have been responding to this kind of siege of their country by the Americans?
Um, in my time when I was there, um, you could have actually seen um, the fight against the enforcement of policies that you know by the U.S. government, and the people were trying to actually defend themselves. And I mean, right there at my school when I was in Ciego, for example, you will have people campaigning against what was happening with the US. Um, you did not find this nonchalant behavior where people did not care. People actually cared, and they spoke about it. There were voices in every single school about it. There were campaigns about it. In terms of the reaction of the people, I think it created some level of creativity.
Hmm.
Um, Due to the lack of certain resources, you find that instead of here in Saint Lucia, for example, I'll use Saint Lucia as an example, where if something stops working, like an electrical appliance, for example, and I use this as an example because it's so true. When we look at wastage and we say, okay,
mm,
my TV stops working, this has caused some level of creativity that now you can actually use your TV up to a particular level. And this is the brilliance of the Cuban people. And it
mm,
shows you that these things can be recycled and they can be used and they can be fixed. And I mean, I believe that, this is the advantage that Cuba has over many other countries.
mm,
It increased creativity. So the harder, and I believe that the harder you are, the harder the situation may be, the more creative people become. Because people don't want to suffer. People
mm,
want to actually create some sense of living, some sense of quality of life that's sufficient enough so you can have a good enough life. And even though it's not for you, it's for your generations to come.
mm,
And I mean, I experienced that. That was my main experience. The level of creativity that it provoked, the campaigning against um,
mm,
um, what was happening. But like I said, I was there at the time when Obama was in office, and this is when I saw the most transition in Cuba and trying to improve the relations and whatnot. Of course,
mm,
the embargo was still there, so you find that certain resources um, were not available as they should be made available. But with all of that, I think Cuba has done so well.
mm,
I mean, if Cuba were to have the liberty to be open and without the embargo, without anything stopping it, I think Cuba would be a jewel in the Caribbean. It would be
mm,
a jewel in the Caribbean with all the creativity it has come up with all the brilliance of the people, how genius the people are, um, the generosity of people. You cannot teach people innate generosity. This is something that's in there. It just happens.
mm,
And I mean, everywhere you go, of course, you'll find people who are difficult, who go against the law and whatnot. But generally speaking, during my time in 2011 to 2018, my experience was, I think, a unique one because for a very long time there was a lot of suffering, and then this time came when Obama came into power and tried to make things a little bit better for Cuba.
okay. Thank you very much. Ambassador, is it okay if I ask you a couple of questions? Um, the You've mentioned that this will be the 30th year that the United Nations General Assembly has called on the US government to abandon this blockade of Cuba. So far, the US government is not budging. How do you think we can bring about that budging of the US government to get them to actually put an end to this brutal blockade of the people of Cuba?
Well, thanks for the question. In fact, as you say, this is, as I said and you quoted, this is the 30th time this vote goes for the stopping the embargo. And practically for the last 20 years, it has been the whole world against two or three countries, basically the US and Israel, that have voted for the embargo against the resolution. And of course, the resolutions of the General Assembly of the United Nations, unfortunately, are not binding on
Mm,
the members. So there is no way that you can impose that decision on a sovereign country, any sovereign country. But the fact that the whole world is against it, is against this brutal measure that has been enforced from the most powerful country in the world against this small island in the Caribbean, is the proof that it has to change. Is the evident uh, truth that it has to change, and eventually, of course, the majority of the people in the U.S. will finally understand that this is an absurd position by the government that is sustained on illegal under an illegal basis, and that in the end it is against the interest of the proper the U.S. The U.S. people. Uh, take take anything. For instance, in science, there's been already for years now a clinical study with a important research center in New York um, on the treatment by um, Cuban vaccines of lung cancers. And this has provided those who have had these tests and have tried these medicines under this clinical study years of life, of extending the ability to live of these persons that have suffered from some types of lung cancers. This is an example, but there are many. There's an enormous amount of possibilities of good relations between the US and Cuba that can provide advantages for both nations, for the US and for Cuba. But these hubris, these people in the administration that do not care about the suffering of the people, is what is maintaining this absurd situation that has lasted too long. There is no parallel in the world to what has happened between the United States and Cuba in terms of the blockade. So we this is something that we cannot stop showing that is
mm,
first illegal, that is a genocide, and that is something that is directed against the whole population. And in fact, the majority of the Cuban people have voted once and again in favor of
mm,
the revolution. But they use every measure. Now there are campaigns stoked to increase violence in Cuba, and those are fed with monies that come from the United States, trying to provide for delinquents to to make instability in Cuba. The same thing happens with migration. Migration is all over the world. All countries migrate. The United States citizens migrate all over the world, and the whole world migrates from one place to another. And in countries like the Caribbean, where everybody comes from somewhere else, because most of the natives were exterminated by
mm,
these colonial wars of the past, it's natural that people migrate. And in fact, there's been a migration from Caribbean people to Cuba, as there have been a migration of Cubans to the Caribbean and to the U.S. And it is something that has lasted for ages, for centuries. But of course, this situation now of strengthening the blockade and strengthening the embargo causes hardship to the population
mm,
and increases the need for migration. And if we go to numbers, you can take any statistic. They tell you that so quantity of Cubans have migrated from this time on these 2 months or this last year or whatever. Compare it to the quantities of any other country in the region.
mm,
Compare it to the quantities of migration all over the world and compare it to the agreement that we have had to have 20,000 visas given for Cubans to go to the US every year, which is an agreement that has lasted for many years, and they have never complied with, they have never fulfilled. And with that, then if you do not allow normal migration, do not allow the granting of visas, they stop the services for the consular office in Cuba on the basis of the supposed Havana syndrome
mm,
of some mysterious disease that was caused by some armed weapon that has not been identified and does not exist. The scientists have said so. Scientists not from Cuba, from the United States, from the world have said there is no weapon to do that effect. But that they stopped. And then how many consulates are there of the United States in the Caribbean? There from Central America, Mexico, you name it. They decided every Cuban who wanted to migrate has to go to the Guyana on the other side of the Caribbean to apply for a visa. You see, it's a chain of ways to make it difficult and then provide for conditions for people to try to immigrate illegally. And it's artificially made. It's totally artificially built. It could be very easily solved if we agree to a normal way of having visas required at the embassy in Cuba and people travel to the United States. That is very simple. And they have the measures to do it, they have the way to do it. There is nowadays, there are ways to do almost everything online. Most of the world works online.
mm,
During the pandemic, everything was done online for isolations provoked by the distancing required by such a viral disease. But now they have to go in person, spend a lot of enormous amount of money to travel, and wait for days until they are given an answer that can be no, can be cancellation. You lose all that money.
mm.
It's all artificially made. It's all to make Cubans suffer, the Cuban population suffer. It's a
Ambassador,
it's a criminal act of war.
it
Yes.
is. It is. Um, Generally, when I'm not sure where the saying came from, but generally, what the point is, when people notice that you're advancing in life and you have a level of greatness in you, you will have some who will be on your side and you will have some who will not want to be on your side. They will actually want to take you down. And I think, Cuba has a lot of greatness. I mean, I continue to see the genius right there in Cuba. It's pouring. It's overflowing its edges. It's a lot of genius that Cuba has, and I think the rest of the world can see this brilliance. The rest of the world can see it. They admire it. They feel it. And I mean, I think this is why we continue to strive for solidarity with Cuba, and we continue to strive for the Cuban population, because at the end of the day, like you said, it's the Cuban population. So what you know, I always ask myself that question. Actually, I think until last week, I asked myself, what will it take? What will it really take for the embargo to stop? What will it really take for the embargo to stop? What will it really, really, really take for us to come to the table, all of us to come to the table and see why, understand why. Why has this gone on for so long? What will it take for, a proper conversation between the US and Cuba and to actually iron this out? Because at the end of the day, just like you said, this forces migration, this forces so many things, and it forces suffering. When we think about mental health at the end, and you think about how this is going to affect the generations to come, you know, you wonder, would we have the same level of mental strength to withstand what is happening right now, what has happened in the past? And things are getting harder and harder as the time goes by. Look at now that the world is going through recession, and it hasn't been said, but we're going through recession.
Yes, of
And
course.
exactly. So I mean, what would it really take for this conversation to actually happen and iron things out and stop this? We really need to strive for peace. And this is the source. This is where peace. This is where we will get peace from.
Can I?
Yeah.
I wanted to come in there with one final question, actually, for both you, Dr. Joanna, and Ambassador Pastrana. Um, this was one of the areas that Isaac was going to address in his talk, which is about what is it that can be done to support Cuba and her people in, as you said, Joyanne, bringing us to a place where this embargo is lifted and the people of Cuba can actually, for the first time since they made their revolution, behave and have access to the world unimpededly. Because I find it's intriguing that America fought a long war in Vietnam, but it doesn't have the kind of cruel embargo imposed on Vietnam as it has on Cuba. And of course, now, Vietnam is developing economically and so on. So I think the question I'm posing to both of you is, in your estimation, what is the solidarity activities that can be taken up here in the Caribbean region that will lead us, even if it's a step by step, towards this day that this cruel embargo is lifted from the people of Cuba?
Ambassador, you want to go first or?
Well, I must say that, as I told you, in the next couple of days, the United States movement for the normalization of relations between Cuba and the United States will organize a rally, online rally, to try to maintain within the United States this information about all that is happening, and how can this change. And you should try from the Caribbean, all our solidarity movement within the Caribbean and the diaspora of the Caribbean, to connect to the Latin American and Caribbean network that is going to even connect to this uh, rally that will be held online, and it's been promoted by the U.S. Committee on the Normalization of Relations between the United States and Cuba. This is formed by a number of associations within the United States that have worked: Pastors for Peace, Bridges of Love, the Pink Coalition, enormous number of organizations of the civil society within the United States that is trying to increase the conscience of the United States population on this cruelty of this abnormal embargo that has lasted for so long, and, as you said, has no real basis,
Mhm.
no objective basis, and is repudiated by almost all the members of the United Nations General Assembly. So we have to increase conscience within the United States, and we have to increase conscience within our countries.
Mm.
Nowadays, people are distracted by a number of entertainment movements, not only within the normal state of entertainment in every country, but also through the social networks. And
Mm.
people are distracted. People are distracted, are shown a virtual world that keep them out of the true different difficulties that we're facing in the world. As you said,
Mhm.
doctor, very recently we are in the middle of a recession that is coming, and people are not aware, are really not aware, and not aware of the cascading crises that come upon all of us, for
Exactly.
which solidarity, interrelations, and the strengthening of our small islands and economies and peoples are the only way to live through all that is going to happen in the next few years. Not mentioning the burgeoning climate crisis that is coming
Yes,
upon us,
coming up
for
on
which
us.
we are
Exactly.
very well aware in the Caribbean because of hurricanes.
Mm,
All of us. So within all this situation, all the actions of solidarity of all of our societies among themselves and with Cuba are an essential way to provide grounds for a successful victory over these enormous challenges that we are having. In fact, the Caribbean has been doing, in comparison with the rest of the world, did very well against COVID. And if we take numbers, you can take statistics any way you want it. And the proof is that the solidarity among the Caribbean countries provided resources to fend off the worst effect of the crisis of COVID-19. And we proved to be stronger than much richer societies and much richer countries in which they could not fend as effectively the passing of the COVID-19 epidemic. So we can prove that solidarity is a way forward. And it is not this type of illegal war that
mm,
will prevail in the end. And that's why that's
mm,
why what you do as solidarity movements in cooperation and in making understandable the situation that Cuba is facing is a way to go forward in this
mm,
challenges. And of course, this next couple of days, engage with our colleagues of
mm.
the solidarity movement in the United States and Canada and the rest of the Caribbean, the rest of Latin America, um, in supporting the vote in the UN against the embargo. This is the way to make conscience in the United States about the difficulties that Cuba is facing. Thank you.
Thank
Yeah.
you very
I
much.
see. I think Ambassador covered it so nicely. I mean,
Oh,
just to, I think, the little things, the little things that we put together and we do, they make massive, massive impacts. Hi, Mr. Sunny.
Hi,
Welcome.
how are you? Greetings.
Well, greetings, greetings, greetings
greetings.
from St.
Hello.
Lucia. How are you?
Fine. Had to deal with a family health emergency, and so forth. It's being resolved as we speak. Yeah.
Yes, great. So, are you able to speak with us tonight? And I
Yes,
know
yes,
we've spoken.
I'm able to speak with you tonight, but I'm sure the ambassador, as all Cuban diplomats who are among the most able, if not the most able diplomats in the world, has handled the situation impeccably.
Yeah, he's done a marvelous job. I think but the more we have to fight for this cause,
Mm.
the more we put our voice out there, the more impact we will make. So I will allow you I'll just give you a brief bio about you. Of course, let me introduce you. To those who are coming in right now, Mr. Isaac Sani is part of the Canadian Network in Solidarity with Cuba, and his topic today will be on the effects of the blockade on the Cuban people and the importance of the solidarity with Cuba. And just a little about Mr. Sani. Isaac Sani is a Cuban specialist at Dalhousie University, Halifax, Canada. From 2008 to 2022, he served as co-chair and national spokesperson of the Canadian Network on Cuba, with which he now serves in an advisory capacity. His teaching and scholarship encompass Africa, the Caribbean, the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, Cuba, and Black Nova Scotian history. He is the author of the highly praised book Cuba, A Revolution in Motion, and the forthcoming Cuba, Africa, and the Apartheid's End, Africa's Children Return. In reviewing Sani's new book, Dr. Hakeem Adi, a leading scholar on Pan-Africanism, Africa and African diaspora, states that Cuba, Africa, and Apartheid's End is a definitive account of Cuba's role in the liberation of Southern Africa, especially South Africa, and Namibia, centering on the Battle of Quito Canavale. Isaac Sanei skillfully and meticulously chronicles the internationalism of the Cuban government and its people to repay Cuba's debt to Africa, the ancestral homeland of so many citizens. So, Mr. Isaac, I welcome you to the floor to speak to us about your topic.
Oh, thank you. And I think I probably will be reiterating what the ambassador said. And I don't mean to take up people's time because I know there'll be many questions coming in. But I think one of the most critical components when we think about the impact of the US economic sanctions in Cuba is it's really an economic war. And I remember the first time I saw Fidel Castro speak was in November of 1994 at the first World Meeting in solidarity with Cuba. It was an immense gathering of everyone at that time who basically came there to demonstrate their support and give their support for Cuba. And I remember Fidel standing there and saying, we talk about it being a blockade, we talk about it, the extent of the economic sanctions, but it's really a war against Cuba. And of course, this war, in many senses, began even before the triumph of the Cuban Revolution. I gave a talk recently where I spoke about very early on, before the revolution had even triumphed, the July the 26th movement, the very idea of Cubans seizing control of their destiny, of their country, and establishing what Jose Marti declared was a country with all and for all, i.e. an independent Cuba that would then use its resources for all, was seen as a threat to the United States. And so there was a very early on call that there should be means by which the coming to power of the July the 26th movement, i.e. of Fidel Castro, a movement led by Fidel Castro should not be allowed. And even they began to broach the very early ideas of assassination, right? The revolution triumphed, as we know, and we know that at the end there were various machinations in order to stop the July the 26th movement from coming to power, together with the other revolutionaries as well. And the fulfillment of what many people who study Cuban history would say as the aspirations that came out of October 10th, 1868, those long struggles throughout the 19th century when Cuba was first attempting to throw off the yoke of Spanish colonial domination and establish an independent Cuba. And of course, Jose Marti amplified that. Of course, Carlos Manuel Cespuedes, joined the struggle of independentistas in Cuba together, as you could say, with the struggle of people of African descent in Cuba for liberation. And he brought those streams together. And it was Jose Marti who clearly, among the many things he did, was the ones to join this into a revolutionary stream. And of course, Cubans traced their revolutionary struggle to the 19th century. And of course, through the 20th century, there's various iterations, right, of the Cuban nation attempting to reassert its dignity and control its own destiny. There's a whole history of these struggles. And the July the 26th movement, the revolutionary movement led by Fidel Castro, is part of that Cuban revolutionary tradition, part of that tradition to establish independence and social justice. And of course, when the revolution triumphed, as I mentioned, there was an attempt, there was a military coup that was attempted that was obviously, shall we say, stymied and stopped and defeated by a general strike that took place. But almost immediately, you could think of this revolution was seen by the United States as a threat. And it's important to understand that this year, what we call October, we're coming to this is the last day in October, and it's really lessons of October's for Cuba, right? Obviously, people talk about the missile crisis, the October missile crisis, which brought the world so close to nuclear conflagration, and which clearly was, really, when one looks at the massive aggression the United States had waged against Cuba, we can see why Cuba accepted the offer from the Soviet Union to have missiles on the island as a defensive measure. And in fact, Fidel had wanted the missiles to actually be delivered openly. He made it very clear. Why not deliver them openly? And of course, the United States had already had missiles in Turkey and right on the Soviet border. So there's a tremendous amount of hypocrisy there. But what people tend not to talk about is the massive war of destabilization against Cuba. The Bay of Pigs had only happened in April of 1961. There was Operation Mongoose that was launched in the wake of that, led by Robert Kennedy, in an attempt to assassinate Cuban leaders and actually to undermine Cuban society as well. And of course, there's the famous memo by Mallory, right, who was in the State Department at that time, who really was the architect of a policy that recognized that the Cuban government was extremely popular and had widespread and broad support within Cuba. And the only way that they could hope to bring down the Cuban revolution or alienate that support was to impose sanctions that would reduce Cuba to a point of impoverishment that would lead to frustration and then to what they've longed for a very long time, a social uprising against the revolution. And so they've waged this uninterrupted war. And so the economic war against Cuba, we can say October of 62 represents when the United States begins to formally, legally entrench this economic war against Cuba. But the war precedes that. Eisenhower cutting the sugar quota. It could go on and go on and go on, right? So there's this economic war waged against Cuba. And I think it's important to understand, we can talk about the economic blockade, how much it has cost Cuba. And of course, the Cubans speak extremely eloquently about this. The Cuban Foreign Minister, Bruno Rodriguez, gave a fantastic report to the United Nations. The Cubans have put out their report that demonstrates the fact that every single economic and commercial activity that Cuba attempts to engage in is persecuted by the United States. I myself, it's very interesting, had a very small example of that. A couple of years ago, I live in Canada, to ask to review a manuscript that was being put forward for publication by Palgrave Macmillan. And Palgrave Macmillan is actually owned by a German subsidiary called Springer, and so it's in Germany. And so, I reviewed the manuscript and they gave me a small fee, a small fee. And they were going to transfer the money to my bank account in Canada. So a transaction from Canada from Germany to the United States. And I remember getting a call from my bank saying, well, listen, we're acquiring this transaction because it has Cuba mentioned in it, right? And I said, why? I said, I reviewed the book. It's a transfer from Germany to Canada. Why are you querying this transaction? Simply because it has Cuba mentioned in the memo line. And I said, is it because of economic sanctions? And they said it was because of economic sanctions. So I don't think people understand the overarching nature of how every single transaction that Cuba attempts to engage in is targeted by the United States. In the Office of Foreign Asset Control, which is sort of like the operational arm in which the United States basically follows and implements its sanctions and see who's violating their so-called right to impose their will on people. In the Office of Foreign Asset Control, they have more people dedicated to Cuba than they have dedicated to so-called terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and so on, right? So it is really an attempt to asphyxiate Cuba, to negate its independence, right? Either to asphyxiate it for two reasons. One, as I said, to provoke, as Mallory wanted, social discontent, to lead to an uprising, which then can be a pretext for the United States to intervene, but also to destroy Cuba as the example. Cuba is the unforgivable revolution. And very early on, the Kennedy administration recognized, and there's a document by Arthur Schlesinger, who was an advisor to Kennedy, where they say that Cuba has shown what can happen when people in the Americas, in Latin America and the Caribbean, take matters into their own hand and throw off imperial domination. And this example was something that was unacceptable. There are two things that are unacceptable. any country in the Western Hemisphere that, and I would argue even in the rest of the world, that exercises its independence from Western imperialism, particularly U.S. hegemony, and more importantly, when one attempts to create a new society, i.e., a socialist society that can provide an example, an alternative to other societies as well. Now, one of the things that I think is very important, and we in the Canadian Network and Cuba and others have been targeting, is this duplicitous and vindictive placing of Cuba on the so-called list of state sponsors of terrorism, right? Everybody knows that Cuba has been a victim of terrorism. I know that there's a very strong move in CARICOM to get October the 6th labeled as an international day against terrorism, particularly civil terrorism against civil airliners, because Cuba was a victim of that. We can talk about the over 3,000 Cubans who have been the victim of terrorist attacks, all with the tacit complicity of the United States. So Cuba has been a victim. And when Donald Trump put Cuba on that list, it was clearly a vindictive act, and basically to add to the more than 240 measures he had actually put on, additional measures he had put on Cuba to try and asphyxiate and destroy the economy, to cut Cuba off from the rest of the world, and to destroy the Cuban example that it is possible to have a society based on not just dog eat dog, where people are left to fend for themselves, but society that attempts to use within very difficult circumstances, in the midst of an imperial world and a capitalist world, in the midst of a global economic crisis, to attempt to use what limited resources it has for the benefit of its people. So part and parcel of this economic war against Cuba is not only to destroy Cuba's independence, but to destroy the example of Cuba and to destroy the fact that socialism can be a viable alternative to the kind of chaos and we see in the world today. And Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel has made that very, very clear in many of his speeches, right? That it's attempt to destroy Cuba as an example. So one of the things about this economic war, and we can go into more detail in terms of how, for example, the United States uses its control of the SWIFT system in which international banking transactions takes place to make it impossible for many countries to actually engage in transactions with Cuba. It makes it prohibitively difficult. We have the Helms-Burton Act. We have the Torricelli Act, which makes shipping and other actions much more expensive for Cuba. And so there's this attempt, as I said, to asphyxiate the Cuban Revolution, to deliberately to destroy this example. And on top of that, it's part and parcel of an open destabilization campaign as well. I think we cannot divorce the economic war against Cuba from the destabilization campaign that's waged in the social media, in terms of trying to provide all sorts of negative and false propaganda against Cuba, and also to try and basically use the difficult economic situation that Cuba has found itself in because of the global economic crisis, the intensification of the U.S. economic war against Cuba, okay, to try and foment discontent in Cuba, not only to create the pretext that the United States can intervene, but more importantly, to destroy the credibility of the Cuban Revolution in people's eyes. But what we see is despite this, despite the economic war against Cuba, Cuba continues to maintain the social indicators in terms of life expectancy, infant mortality, literacy. That would be the envy of most developed countries in the world. More importantly, we also see that Cuba's internationalism, and the new book I have coming out on Cuba's role in the struggles in Africa. Obviously, I have to pay tribute to the work of people like Pero Helaces. I'm building on his work, and I've produced a very detailed description of the Battle of Quito Cuarneval and these encounters in Angola and so forth. But Cuba's commitment in Southern Africa is part and parcel of a commitment not only to Africa that has gone on even despite the end, even as the Cold War has ended, but also to internationalism on a world scale, providing a different model of internationalism. Even President Obama acknowledged that Cuba was putting the United States to shame precisely because of the aid it was giving to Africa, particularly during the Ebola epidemic. And so Cuba offers a very unique model of international relations, one in which the relations between countries can be based on mutual respect, equality, based not on power and self-interest, but based on solidarity, right? Based on the ethos of sharing as opposed to the ethos of having, right? And I think these are the things that the U.S. economic war and its destabilization campaign are aimed at, to destroy that there is an example that could provide hope for this world. I like to end by saying that we need hope desperately. We need hope
Yeah,
desperately. I
you're
teach
right.
at university in Canada, and I'm dealing with students who have a level of despair, disillusionment, okay, almost nihilism, precisely because it's hard to feel optimism about the future. I've interviewed a lot of people from the 60s and the 70s who, in those struggles, they say at that moment when they were young people, they believed they were about to create a new world. Now, that did not come about, but they believed that they had an optimism of the spirit, of the heart, of the mind. But what has happened now with the ecological catastrophe that faces the world? And I should add that Cuba is a leader in fighting climate change. It has a plan to 2100 to deal with climate change, right? And so on. That with the climate and the ecological catastrophe facing us, with growing massive social inequality, with the threat of war, right, with the disintegrations of society, Cuba provides a profound example that it's possible for human beings to construct societies centered around human beings, centered around social justice, centered around trying to build equity and equality. And of course, the oligarchs who rule the United States and rule imperialism don't want that example, right? They don't want people to know there's an alternative. So Cuba, at the end of the day, represents hope, and imperialism is against hope. And I think at the heart of this economic war, at the heart of this destabilization campaign, is to snuff out the hope of humanity, right? And Cuba is a beacon.
Wow.
Well, thank you
Wow.
very much.
Wow, wow, wow. Thank you so much, Mr. Isaac, for this passionate breakdown of the influence of the embargo and the blockade, the US blockade on Cuba over the past years. I think we've all been impacted over the past few minutes by what you said. And one of the things I really, really want to highlight, well, a few of the things I really want to highlight from what you said, when you spoke about the fact that we should all have a decision to control our destiny. We should have a decision. We should be able to make that decision to control our destiny. This is always important. And the fact that the human is the center, the human out of everything else, human is center. And we must always remember the fact that the the the, the longer the influence of the impact, the economic impact on Cuba, the longer the more difficult it will be, the harder it will be on a human-centered society. And this is, as you said, Cuba is an example to the rest of the world, having the human being as the center. One of the things I experienced in Cuba, I will speak about also, that literacy that you spoke about. You know, you go to anywhere else in the world, and the way a Cuban person would rumble medicine, it's completely different to how a regular person would rumble medicine. From the day they saw the doctor to the day I mean, it's an example because I'm in the medical field,
Mm.
right? But the way they speak about the prescription, the detailed dose and everything, this tells you that you're dealing with a community, a society which is very literate. And it doesn't have to be with having a degree in medicine. It simply has to be with a human-centered society where people pay attention. And I mean, I really love that you touch on those ideas. I just mentioned a while ago before you came on, and you summarized it really nice. Well, summarized, but you spoke about it really nicely. That when greatness is seen, it is seen as a threat. When greatness is seen, when people see greatness, most times it's seen as a threat. So I mean, I think these are some of the things that like you said. Cuba is experiencing it, and more, time and time, Cuba has creativity to actually show that, hey, I can come out of this. Hey, I can't grow. And the more we try to stifle, the more creativity we will have, right? So I really, really, really appreciated both you and Ambassador for coming on here and, you know, speaking to us about what the US blockade is really doing to send to Cuba, and how it is actually impacting not just Cuba as a word, but the Cuban people, right? So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, and hope we continue to um continue with this solidarity and continue creating partnerships against this US blockade, so that the people can have and make a decision for their destiny. Yes.
If there's one thing I can add, I would like to encourage people, when the United Nations vote is taking place, the UN actually has a live stream. Listen to the countries that speak about Cuba in such powerful and eloquent terms, particularly the countries from Africa who will stand with Cuba. And once again, we will see an overwhelming vote in favor of Cuba. And it's truly, truly astonishing, right, to know that this island in the Caribbean has played such a significant role across the world. And of course, we can't forget that Cuba also has a very close relationship with Haiti, understanding that its historical role parallels that of the Haitian Revolution and so forth. And, as Haiti now faces imminent imperial invasion, right? Okay, Cuba once again stands as an example that it's possible, to defeat imperialism and also to resist.
Yes.
Very, very true. Very true. Ambassador and Mr. Sani, thank you so much for coming on and speaking to us about everything that's going on. We will move on to the other presentation. We end with a cultural presentation by Brother Obi Egbua, um, who is part of the Zimbabwe Cuban Friendship Association. And Brother Obi will speak about an extract from his work titled Battle Cry for Cuba and Zimbabwe. So,
bodily functions. Sweat pours from my brow because I'm feverishly hoping I say something that will make you move right now. Yes, bow to the movement, but to many it's irrelevant, a hiccup. Hold on, wait, hold your breath. Because what I'm saying may suspend deaths. Because we've been waiting in the excrement of the experiment meant to bend your mental. I meant to mention what I'm bringing to your attention, capitalism and its need to feed greed. Gordon Gekko said, greed is good. He's crazy. I'm hoping he's understood, because to many it's a threat to make y'all vomit. I digress. It's the mention of Cuba and Zimbabwe that I really want to bring to your attention. They want to commit murder, thinking of cutting off these countries' ability to receive, trade, buy, and sell what they need, leaving them choking nations, revoking starvation, literally, while their nations are left pouring more and more libations. It's been naturally nurtured by the U.S. and the United Nations. Yes, I'm being real. They, the UK, France, Portugal, and Israel, have a halt, stop, freeze, hold, cease, lead, foot, suspension on things that these brothers and sisters need for survival. So, on arrival in their countries, I can see infrastructure fractured, plastered, slate, and rafters, old, automobiles old, because supplies have been controlled by the U.S.'s chokehold. And while Zimbabwe has made 2 steps toward democracy, the IMF and World Bank have ensured steps of hypocrisy. And while Cuba and Zimbabwe celebrate greater than 95% literacy, and Cuba celebrates being one of the world's top healthcare systems, Americans suffer all the ills of the contradictions of wealth vis-a-vis poverty. All the time, America wants the world to hate or feel sorry for them. Ironically, or should I say devilishly, wanting to starve them, erase these brothers and sisters from being actually free. See them as a national security threat for sanctions as a basis, but inadvertently they created an accidental oasis. Because while factories don't have smokestacks looming in Zimbabwe and Cuba, local farms are booming. And when crises have occurred anywhere in the world and panic spread like cancer, Cuba heard the call and answered, offering to send doctors and lend aid and relief, dispelling a lot of misinformed beliefs. We got all along, realizing we in America are surrounded, standing, living in bullshit.
Havana sky. It was not what I had anticipated. Telltale of Orishas in plain sight, reverenced and revered in institutions of higher learning, museums, art galleries, Universidad, Casa de Don Fernando Ortiz. The sacred is not secret when there is no shame in having an Africana god or goddess who manifest the same temperament of our ancestors and characteristics of our children yet to be born. Havana sky. Frozen in time without the constraints of a timeline, yet keepers of the history, good or bad, triumphant or sad, Havana sky. Today we drink Cuba Libre at the Havana Club, but first, ahora, we must pour libations to the grandmothers not here and the many compañeros not here under the Havana sky.
So thank you to Brother Obi for this cultural experience. And we invite Brother T, who is part of the St. Lucia Cuban Humanistic Solidarity Association, to say his vote of thanks to our members here and the visitors and guests who have come here. Brother T?
Thank you very much, Dr. Jayan. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to everyone who's logged on, either on Facebook or YouTube. Thank you for coming along and participating. This is a very important mission that we have in the Caribbean to support our Cuban brothers and sisters to get this blockade lifted. I'd like to extend special thanks to Your Excellency Ambassador Pastrana. As always, the information you presented is highly relevant, highly important, and it's very clear for us what needs to be done. So thank you for taking the time tonight to come and share that information with us. To my brother Isaac, I'm, hoping from my heart that everything is okay with your family. But also it's a testament to your commitment that even faced with this family emergency, you carved out the time to be here. So again, a very special thank you to Isaac. And finally to our chair, Dr. Joyanne Chico, who been excellent, who transformed herself from the chair into participant when we weren't sure if Isaac would be able to make it, and who did a really excellent job of chairing the whole session. So on behalf of the Caribbean Network for Solidarity with Cuba, I would extend our thanks to all of you, and we look forward to continuing this work until this brutal and cruel and illegal blockade of Cuba is lifted. So thank you all very much, and good night to everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Viva la
Bye.
Revolución Cubana.
Viva.
Viva
Viva.
la Revolución Cubana.